Last week we began a new homily series called The Story of Your Life. And the reason that's a good way to think about our lives is two reasons. One is we all like stories. We're kind of built that way. Ever since we were kids, we like to have stories told to us. The other reason is that we're in the midst of a story. Our life is a story. And remember, as I said last week, that the difference on how we live that story is what story do we want to be a part of? Do we want to be a part of God's larger story, which we're a part of, that calls us into kind of an epic way of living? Or if we live only the story of our life, it gets very small. And there are major consequences depending on which way you choose to live. Remember, I said also last week that when we want to tell the story of our life, one of the things we have to recognize is God is already the co-author of that story. He's already set things in motion in us that tell a lot of that story. And so we have to kind of understand what's God's part and what's our part in the story of our life. And then finally, last week, we talked about if you really want, the reason we've been given to understand and the reason it's important to know the story of how God is acting in your life is God has a particular part of the story that He's given to each one of us. And it's up to us to share that part which we've been given. So each of us is called to testify to that part of the story of God that He's put in our life. Well, this week, to help us understand even a little more deeply how we are to tell that story of our life, how we're to be honest about the story of our life, we have the readings today. And the readings today talk about something that doesn't seem to be really uplifting at first. It's about regrets. This story of Nehemiah, it's actually one of my favorite stories in the Old Testament. Nehemiah had a lot of things going for him. He was the King Cyrus's cupbearer, the Persian emperor's cupbearer. He had it made. Even though the people of Israel had been in exile, he had risen to this level. Now, the people had already gone back. The people of Israel had already left that exile and gone back to Jerusalem. But Nehemiah hears things are not going well in Jerusalem. That when the people get there, the city is in absolute rubble. And there's no longer a wall to protect the city. Now we might say, well, so what? Build a wall. But when a city doesn't have a wall, it didn't have an identity. Anybody could come in and pillage it again and again. And so without a wall, the people who came back didn't understand who they were. And so the king at Nehemiah asked if he could go back and he could help build this wall. And so the king makes him the governor, and he sends him back, and he's very successful. They build the wall. They restore the city in about 6 months. And what's happening in this scene is they're rededicating the city to God. And how they're doing it is they have all the people and the children old enough to understand. That's why we send the smaller children now to Liturgy of the Word so they can understand in their way. But the children old enough to understand, they begin to read the law. In other words, they stood up and from morning to noon, they read the whole of the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And the people who had not heard, or maybe they had heard, but they hadn't understand what God was doing in the covenant law, all of a sudden found themselves weeping. They were weeping because they heard this covenant relationship that God had been calling them to, and they saw where they failed. They saw where they were not living up to this. And they were regretting that they had not lived this life of faith, that there was not this integrity in their covenant relationship. But that's not the end of the story, because what does Nehemiah and Ezra, the priest who's interpreting all of this for them, they say, this is a moment to rejoice, not to weep. What they're saying is that, yes, it's important to understand our regrets, but it's precisely in our regrets that God wants to heal us. It's precisely when we understand where we've fallen that we can let God in so that we become more compassionate. Because that's one of the things that we have to understand if we really want to tell our story, is where are our regrets? Where are those moments when we've failed to live up to the gospel in its integrity? Now, there's maybe some people here who are too young to have regrets, maybe the littlest of among us. But if we live long enough, we live to have regrets. It may be in merely a moment. It may have been a lie that was told that you say, and it just eats at your heart that you ever told that particular lie because of what else set in motion. It may be a one-night stand somewhere. It may be a relationship that you let go. It may be a decision that was in your youth or in your young adulthood, but yet there's this regret. Well, the first thing that we do as a church is say, if that regret is still on your heart as fresh, bring it to the sacrament of reconciliation. Bring it to a place where it can be healed. Because that's what Jesus came for. Luke is saying, I'm telling a story. Now, he's saying, I'm going to have this well-ordered account of Jesus' life. But what's the story that Theophilus had heard? It was that Jesus, even from the very first moment of his ministry, which is what is captured in this scene in Nazareth, is here to turn things upside down, to proclaim freedom to prisoners, recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim a year of favor in God. In other words, to bring healing. That's his mission. But if we want to tell our story on how God is acting in our life, and we don't yet understand where our regrets are, well, maybe it's because we really don't understand our own life yet enough. Because this is not I'm not trying to send you all into a depression trip today. But when we understand those regrets, then we can let God's mercy in, and then it makes us a more compassionate person. It makes us a more compelling witness of God's merciful love. I'll give you a great example of this. I really believe, even despite the fact that it's been going on for so long, that the cause of pro-life is beginning to change in this country. Attitudes are really changing. And I think one of the reasons that it is that the falsehood about abortion has been that it provides women freedom. And the truth is, anyone who's ever dealt with anybody who has had an abortion or participated in abortion, it is absolutely full of regret in people's lives. I can tell you, dealing with people who bring these regrets to me, they are just burdened by this. And it is so freeing when they bring it to the sacrament of reconciliation. It's so freeing when they understand that God is healing them in that moment. And some of the most effective pro-life voices, pro-life witnesses, are in fact women who've had abortions. In fact, Jane Roe, the pseudonym for the woman who was in the original decision, she found her faith and is now one of the most outspoken pro-life voices in the country today. You see, it's out of our regrets that God heals us. It's out of our regrets that God can mission us. Knowing our regrets is not the end of the story, but it is an important part of our story that we need to know if we're going to really know how God is acting in and through our life.